Today I'll be talking about the revolution and slavery, a watershed moment. In 1776, at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, from New England to Georgia. The numbers varied greatly from colony to colony, and I'll talk more on that later, but slaves were present in all the colonies. At the same time, a sentiment and a movement opposing slavery had arisen in the decade or so prior to the Revolution, but it was not as strong as the passionate, intense abolitionist movement that emerged 50 years later after 1830. So what is the background of slavery in the colonial era? In the 17th century, when the first colonists came, most labor was some form of bound labor, bound by feudal dues, guild rules, apprenticeships, etc. It was the pre-modern period. What we take for granted, free labor, wage, contractual labor, only slowly emerged from the modern era. It was a world of strict hierarchies which inflicted brutal punishment for breaking work rules or committing even petty crimes. That was the context in which slavery emerged. In colonial America, slavery was concentrated geographically in the Chesapeake region, Virginia and Maryland, and in the Carolina Low Country. Tobacco in the Chesapeake and rice and indigo, a type of dye, a plant that's used to create a dye, grew in the Low Country. Slavery was not adaptable to the economies of the other colonies. There were a few slaves in Rhode Island and Connecticut. They tried to grow tobacco there, tried to replicate the plantation economies of the South, but it didn't really work. Most of their economy was based upon shipping, shipbuilding, and fishing, and farming that supplied those activities. And so the economy of the New England colonies really wasn't adapted to slavery. There were slaves in places like, in some cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and they were servants. Virginia, to give you a contrast, if you want to talk about concentration of slaves, Virginia on the eve of the Revolution had 230,000 slaves. Over 40% of its total population was enslaved. South Carolina had 80,000 slaves, about 60% of its population. In the largest slave colony, Virginia, slavery developed over decades in the 17th century. Initially, work was done by indentured servants. They were white, mostly Englishmen from the British Isles. Slavery had disappeared from English law, so that the first black servants that came, and they came first in 1619, had an indeterminate status. They didn't quite know how to treat them, how to consider. Some of them were considered indentured servants and gained their freedom after a term of service. Others, we find 20 years later, were being held for life. So their status was indeterminate for several decades, really. By the 1670s and 1680s, the flow of white labor was drying up. The population growth of the British Isles and the economy in the British Isles was changing, and so that the flow of white indentured servants was drying up. And the Indians, another source of labor that was at hand, didn't prove easy to enslave. They could escape at any time to the wilderness that they knew well. They had allies in the wilderness. It was dangerous to try to enslave them. And the other big hindrance to enslaving them was that they didn't have the immunities to disease that the Europeans were carrying. Whereas the Africans, because they had been exposed along the coast to the European diseases for 2 centuries, had developed immunities to things like the measles, which would wipe out Native Americans in huge numbers. So the Indians proved difficult to enslave. At the same time, the African slave trade, by the late 17th century, the 1680s or so, was supplying a large number of Africans to North America. Virginia adopted its first full slave code in 1705. South Carolina, on the other hand, was developed as a colony from Barbados. Its slave code was brought over directly from Barbados. Barbados is a small island, 166 square miles. It had originally been settled in the 1630s and 40s by whites who used indentured servants to grow tobacco. By the 1650s, it switched to sugar, which was a far more profitable crop. And by the 1660s and 1670s was completely a slave economy in a slave society. Some of the planters came over from Barbados in the 1670s and settled in what is now South Carolina. They brought over with them their Barbadian slave code. It began to thrive in South Carolina. Initially, it didn't thrive very much. They were just growing a few crops and had livestock to support the much more prosperous slave society of Barbados. But by 1700, they started growing rice. And rice was a crop that could feed slaves in the West Indies. It was not perishable or readily perishable. It was pretty easily stored and transported, and so it became profitable. The colonies south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that's the Maryland and Pennsylvania border, the colonies south of the Mason-Dixon line became slave societies, meaning that their economies, their whole society was based upon slavery. That was the primary means of production in the society, and it also deeply affected the way that people thought of themselves and interacted with each other, even whites. So they were slave societies, as opposed to those north of the Mason-Dixon line, which were merely societies with slaves. Places like New Jersey, which had 6% slave population, Pennsylvania, which had about 5 or 6, Massachusetts with about 3% slaves. They had a few slaves that were used for household servants. Notoriously in Boston, ship captains would often bring back slaves and have them as their servants, but they were not an essential part of the economy or the society. They were a very small element. After 1700, slavery became based upon race completely. White was free, black was slave. That was the clear implication of the Virginia slave code and the way slavery had developed in South Carolina. The color difference became fixed, and it also helped to make the system enforceable because the color of the slaves made them stand out, and so they could be captured if they tried to escape. And so the system worked in upon itself. It had interlocking ways of supporting itself. It came to be taken for granted that blacks should be slaves and whites should be free, even whites who were indentured servants and apprentices, because that went on for until the American Revolution, really. You still had some indentured servants in America, and apprenticeship was a fairly common practice, but you would graduate from apprenticeship at 21. So they knew that whites would eventually become free, but slaves wouldn't. Black people were meant to be slaves. That was the concept from usage that went on for generations after 1700, right up through the American Revolution. The slavery that developed differed from pre-modern slavery in two ways. One, it was racial, right? We hadn't seen racial slavery before in history. And two, well, to add something to that, let me explain a little more. People had been held in slavery mostly because they were captured in warfare. Very often they were people who had a different religion than others, and those were most often the motives for enslaving people. The second reason, other than that it was racial, was that it converted the slave into private property, into a commodity that could be sold on the market with no rights whatsoever. And so this was different. In a pre-modern society, even slaves, everyone, it was a very hierarchical society, but everybody had certain rights and certain protections. In this new modern era of converting the slave to private property, the slave literally had no real rights. In the decades after the Revolution, slavery's protection as a private property would come into growing conflict with the concept of human rights. Human rights, the natural rights that they speak of in the Declaration of Independence, would come into conflict with property rights. And so we're going to see that conflict work itself out all the way up through the American Revolution. North America was a relative economic backwater. We need to remember that as a slave system. The big money in 1720 or 1750, or even right on the eve of the American Revolution, the big money was in growing sugar in the West Indies. Islands like Jamaica were much more productive of revenue for the king's government than were Virginia and South Carolina. And it made a big difference in the way the slave system developed in America. One was that there weren't so many importations of slaves because the planters didn't have as much money, because their crops were different. They tended to bring in small increments of slaves through the slave trade. And over time, and it didn't take very long, like a generation, it was the early 1700s, there was an equal ratio between men and women. This was not the case in the West Indies and in other slave societies. In those societies, there would often be 3 or 4 men for every woman. But in North America, there was an equal ratio of men and women, and so the slaves tended to form families and communities. The slave force grew much more through reproduction than importation. So we had a slave force in the Chesapeake region and in South Carolina that was growing on its own, that was growing more by births than by importation. So that meant that increasing numbers of slaves by the 1730s, 40s, 50s, by the era of the American Revolution, were American-born. They were in the second, many were in the second, and some in the third generation of being born on these shores. And they developed a distinctive African-American culture with elements that were drawn from Africa that they brought with them, with elements that were European, of their own choosing, I might add, and from Native Americans. So it had 3 streams of influence building an African-American culture. They used religion, folklore, music, and song as a protection against the oppressions of slavery. They were an enslaved people, but their mind and spirit, their psychology was their own. And this made slavery different in North America. You had a slave community. They had a slave culture that served as a psychological protection for the identity of the individuals in it. So they were enslaved. They were a people enslaved, but they weren't necessarily slaves, certainly mentally and in spirit. For the owners, it was also a different situation. They were not absentee owners. They lived on the plantations with the slaves. And this is quite different. That wasn't the case in the West Indies and other slave societies in the New World. They tried to bring a pre-modern concept of paternalism with them. Remember, we're at a transition point here between a pre-modern feudal era and a modern era where you're going to have really a capitalist system of production. And they tried to bring with them a pre-modern concept of paternalism, of being benevolent masters, of regarding the slaves as their people, as sort of an extended family, was the way that they felt about it. They soon found that it conflicted with the modern reality of the economics of slavery, right? Because we were making that transition into a modern era, and part of that modern era was trade and finance, and these were large capitalist operations, the plantations. They were some of the first modern ones in the modern world. And so you had to have a labor discipline. And the owners found that they had to apply harsh punishments, that the whip and the lash were not unknown, and that even masters that thought of themselves as benevolent, and were in many ways, masters like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, would have the lash would be used on their plantations. You know, it was just part of, it was built into the process of how it was going to have to work. Now, slavery had gone largely unquestioned, and this is a remarkable fact, I think, for modern people to understand how for the first 100 years almost of its existence, from the late 17th century almost to the era of the American Revolution, there had been very little questioning of slavery. It was just part of, it was something that had arisen, something that worked, and no one seemed to question it. But in that decade preceding the revolution, questions began to arise from a number of different sources. One was that for a number of years before that, a small group of Quakers in Pennsylvania had questioned slavery. They had thought that it didn't fit with religious values, that the values of each individual having the interlight from God conflicted with the idea of slavery. And so Quakers like John Woolman and Anthony Benazet had preached among the Quakers and even outside of the Quakers that slaveholding was wrong. But what began to break even more than that and spread it much more thoroughly were two things. One was the Great Awakening, which was an evangelical movement that had started really in the 1740s but picked up enormous steam by the 1760s of Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, of groups and sects like the Methodist and the Baptist and the New Light Presbyterians. And again, there was a religious concept that all people were equal before God, and therefore holding people in slavery was wrong, that this violated that concept. So it entered a disturbing element for slaveholders. And then the other one happened at the intellectual level, at a much, where the religious concepts often were of an emotional and spiritual feeling. The other attack on slavery came from the intellectual level, and that was the Enlightenment that spread over Europe and into North America and in the 1760s. And there you had all sorts of ideas of human rights, of human dignity, of tolerance, a real questioning for harsh punishments, a number of things that had been taken for granted in the previous era, and slavery being one of the foremost of those. And so a real questioning arose among, at two levels really, among the ordinary people because of the awakening, and among the elite, the people who were educated, because of the Enlightenment. So this was a whole new intellectual climate that had arisen. And so the treatment and the ownership of slaves came in for questioning. People became suddenly uncomfortable with it. They had to begin defending it. One historian of slavery, Peter Colchin, terms it a watershed moment that separates the pre-modern and modern eras. We've referred to that several times earlier in the talk, and Colchin makes that point very distinctly. There were new ideas of natural rights, of political liberty, of freedom of religion, and equality before the law. And if you held those beliefs, if you considered them part of your personal system of beliefs, then it became difficult to hold slaves. So there was a contradiction was arising in the life of American slaveholders. Moreover, as we moved into the Revolutionary era, into the mid-1770s, we were fighting for those rights. We were proclaiming those rights. We were saying that those rights were the ones that the King of Britain and Parliament were ignoring. And so this contradiction of holding slaves and of claiming your rights became even sharper. In response to that, north of the Mason-Dixon line, where, again, there were societies with slaves, where slavery was not a predominant part of the economy and of the society, north of the Mason-Dixon line, there was a movement to end slavery, mostly through gradual emancipation. And gradual emancipation was that you would set a date, and then after that date, all persons, all black people born after that date who had been in slavery would become free at a certain age. And that was the mode by which most of the states north of the Mason-Dixon line chose to do it. Vermont, for example, and Vermont wasn't a state at this time. Vermont was a republic. I know it wasn't a state until 1792, and it's it's part of the American Revolution, and there's Ethan Allen, and I know it has a warm place in revolutionary thought. But Vermont in 1776 was the first of the American states that banned slavery. They banned it in their constitution, and they banned it outright. Of course, there were probably fewer than 30 slaves in the entire colony, probably fewer than that. But then following them, in 1780, Pennsylvania adopted a plan of gradual emancipation. Now, it was going to be a long time before slavery was completely ended there, because they said that after 1780, that children born to slave mothers would have to serve until they were 28 years old if they were male, and 21 years old if they were female. So that meant that potentially slavery could go on until the 1840s, and it did. You could still find slaves in Pennsylvania in the early 1840s. So it was a very gradual emancipation. This is not an outright abolition. Massachusetts, on the other hand, abolished slavery in 1787. They based it upon their 1780 Constitution. It was a court ruling that got rid of it. All of the other states north of Mason-Dixon followed it, with the last two being New York in 1799 and New Jersey in 1804. And the last slave was freed in New York in 1847. So these were gradual emancipation laws that took place and that removed slaves from those colonies and from those states by then. In the southern states of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, the upper South, there were changes in manumission laws. Again, the idea is that we feel guilty about holding slaves. And in fact, some planters responded, a few notably, by freeing all of their slaves. There were a few examples of that, just freeing all their slaves. The more often the pattern was that a master would free all or certain slaves in a will, or free a slave perhaps for some meritorious action or through some agreement. And before 1782, before the change was made in the Virginia law, there were very few free blacks in Virginia. There were about 1,200 free blacks in Virginia in 1780. And the law was changed in 1782, allowing masters, instead of having to go to the state legislature to get a special bill passed to free a slave, the master could simply draw up a manumission agreement and take it to a county court and free slaves. So over that decade, from after the 1782 law was passed, almost 12,000 slaves became free in Virginia. So there was the creation in Virginia and in Maryland. There were similar laws in Maryland and North Carolina. And so you had the growth in both of those, in all three of those states, of a large free black population. Okay, to summarize on this one, the Revolutionary period brought the first widespread questioning of slavery, right? We didn't have it until then. People had, believe it or not, which is hard for modern people to believe, they had not questioned slavery in its existence. In the states north of Maryland, where slaves were few, the institution was ended, usually gradually, over 2 decades after the victory at Yorktown. So it's going to take a long time before it's removed. From Maryland south, slavery persisted. Its ending was blocked by an unwillingness to make an economic sacrifice. Remember, this would have been an enormous capital loss for the owners of slaves, and there were many of them in places like Maryland and Virginia and South Carolina. So they were unwilling to sacrifice that, and as much or more by the inability to envision a biracial republic. What would you do when you had freed 40% of these people, or in the case of South Carolina, 60%, a majority of these people? How would they fit into a society in which for a century, to be black was to be a slave and to be white was to be free? So this was something that the founders and the leaders in those states couldn't get around. That was they couldn't get over those two hurdles. And so what we see is this struggle during the Revolution of a sentiment against slavery, and it has a number of different sources, but it's not as strong, it's not as intense as it will be later. And it runs up against a very stubborn economic interest, and an economic interest that's backed by a racial concern. And so slavery begins to be very difficult to get rid of. And what you see, because of this pattern that we have described here, is the beginning of the split between the North and the South after 1800, where you have an area of the country that has freed slaves, that's committed to freeing slaves, and an area of the country, the 5 southern states, that are committed to holding slaves. So I think that will be all. Thank you very much.